Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just maybe if someone wants to go into the public comments and say, all good. Yeah, great. Um, yeah, good. We're starting. Okay, so welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to this weird form of presentation that everyone's still getting used to. But I hope everyone's got their hot chocolate or nice cup of tea or cold beer and is in a comfortable place, ready to listen. And I hope the story is worth listening to. So I'm going to turn my camera off, I think, because you don't need to look at me, and just start talking to the slides. And if anyone has any questions or things like that, you can pop them in the Q&A and I'll try and answer them at the end. And we might even try and see if we can turn people's mics on and make it interactive, but we'll see how we go. So I'm just going to turn my camera off and make a start. So I kind of provocatively titled this talk Achieving Greatness, and I guess I should qualify what I mean with that so you don't think I'm any more pretentious than you already do. I really wanted to think about personal satisfaction in the work that you do and how you can be proud of the work that you do. And I don't have all the answers, but I can certainly say I'm very proud of this work, and hopefully as I explain the story, you'll get to understand why. So as I mentioned in the introduction for the talk itself, we're in this really interesting situation that humanity hasn't really faced for probably a century, and it's very different than it was back in the days of the Spanish flu, although if you look at the posters, they're pretty much telling you to do the same thing as they did before. But one of the positive things about this, I think, is that it gives us time to reflect and to imagine how things could be better when things eventually, go back to normal or somewhat back to normal. And I think one of the great things is that working at home and having time away from the things that or the routine that you normally have, is that it gives you a chance to sort of personally reflect and think about how you approach work and how you might approach it differently in the future. So if there's anything I want you to get out of this talk, I guess it's really the idea that you how to find satisfaction in what you do and how to develop a confidence in the work that you do, because if you don't believe in what you do and you're not confident about it, it's really hard for others. So I think to achieve any kind of greatness, you have to think that you're great first. Now, I have met a lot of people who think they do great work, and I might disagree with that. So it's not a guarantee, but at least I think it's a prerequisite. Now, I'm going to tell you about my story, and hopefully some of it will be interesting, but only you know what works best for you. So I'm not suggesting that you follow the way that I did things, but purely that you just use this as a way, perhaps over the Easter break, to sort of think about how you approach the work that you do. So on with the story. So once upon a time, which was, whoops, sorry, I have to go pressing the wrong button. Once upon a time, which was actually in the early 2000s, I received, several years before, I'd received a very large grant, and I had a fellowship, kind of like what I'm doing now. And I was tasked with building this very rich and complex work that took many, many years, a huge amount of effort. I had 3 people working for me, and there was a lot of pressure to, kind of deliver on something that I'd made in the original grant application, and which was very, very ambitious. Ironically, this work was using virtual reality, so that old chestnut that's been around for a long time. And I'd been invited up to Bendigo Art Gallery to exhibit the work in a group show. And I packed a huge bunch of technology in my car. I drove up and spent like 2 or 3 days installing the work. It was technologically super complex. It was really pushing a lot of what the technology could do to its limits and beyond. It involved, kind of real-time poetry generation, computer graphics, virtual reality. It was set up in this massive room, so there's a huge amount of pressure to get it all working. Anyway, so I got through the opening and went back home, and then ironically, I I caught a virus. I got quite sick, and I was sitting in bed with a fever and kind of a headache and a runny nose and a cough, and I got a call from the gallery telling me that the work had broken down and that I needed to drive back up to Bendigo that night to fix it. So I drove all the way up in the middle of the night, and I think I got there at sort of like 9 or 10 o'clock and had to try and fix the work. There were all these problems with it. Eventually I got it going, but as I was driving back in this kind of, flu-induced stupor, kind of foolishly really to be driving while I was so sick, I kind of resolved that I didn't want to work this way anymore. I felt that having to push things so far wasn't really the way that I wanted to work. And I saw other works in this exhibition that were so much simpler, and I thought actually so much better. So I really took it upon myself to rethink how I approached creating work and what I did. And of course, the story does have a good ending. I ended up with this work called Eden, which is quite old now, but there's been so much time to reflect on it. That's why I chose to talk about it. So I'm going to tell you the story of how I made it, and the actual work itself is not so important. It's more the process that I'm interested in articulating. So I'm going to skip a lot of the technical details and other kinds of things. I mean, I'll show you how it works and what it does. That's important. But the more important point is the process that it came about from. So I think most of us have this, or there's a picture of the final work too. Most of us have had this idea, and particularly this is true if you put things in grants or you try and explain things to other people, that there's this fairly straightforward pathway from conceptualizing something to sort of finding the unicorn, to getting to a final outcome. And that involves lots of work and iterating on the concept until you get to the final outcome. But one of the implications of this is that you have the concept very well established in your brain when you start, and that it's really just a matter of realizing that concept. But I don't really think that's very true, and it's certainly not the way that I've done any work in the past that I would consider to be personally great or even moderately successful. So the way I think about it is much more like this, that you have some kind of vague idea about what you want to do, and you start thinking about that idea a bit more, and you maybe start playing with a few ideas, and it often leads off in all these different pathways. So you may end up going down some kind of road that's completely different, and you abandon that project and start another one. You come across all sorts of different hurdles. You start developing something and realize that it's just not going anywhere. Then you start running out of time and the clock is ticking, and you've got to start doing something, and then you go backwards and revisit what you've done before, and you end up with a turkey. And maybe the turkey morphs into a donkey and that's the end. Maybe the whole project collapses. Or if you're really lucky, maybe the turkey turns into a horse, and eventually the horse turns into a unicorn at the end. So this was sort of very much how this project developed. So I haven't got many quotes in here, but one quote that I have in here that I think is really interesting is from Hiroki Kitano, who's at Sony CSL. So he has this great quote. He says, "Do the research that only you can do." And I think that's a really great way to think about how you differentiate yourself, to say that I'm the only person who could actually do the things that I'm doing. I mean, it's easy to say, but it's really much harder to do. So the big question is really, how do you get to that point where you think, okay, I'm the only person who can really do this? So my thinking about this really revolves around three things, and I'm going to go into them in a reasonable amount of detail. So I see this real connection between ideas, experience, and experimentation. So these are the three sort of pillars that I built this work from. And of course, these things are all interconnected. Your experiences influence your ideas influence what you actually do, what you actually do is part of your experience, and so on. But one of the things that's important is that ideas can come from anywhere, and most people think, oh, you've got to have a great idea to start with. But as I pointed out earlier, often the idea is very ill-formed and vague. And so my approach was to try and think about other people's ideas as much as I could, and to absorb as much information as I could, and not be worried about how original those ideas were. I mean, because lots of people have fantastic ideas, and there's nothing wrong with absorbing those ideas and turning them into your own. But how do you turn them into your own? And I think that is through the experience that you bring to those ideas and the way that you actualize them into something. And that is really what makes you, as in the person who does the research that only you can do. So the point is really that you don't necessarily have to have the best ideas or original idea, but through experiences and experimentation, those ideas and what you create can become original. So let's talk a little bit more about ideas. And so now I'll get down into the specifics of what I developed for this work. So at the time, this is early 2000s, I was really into reading a lot of books. I still am. I don't read as many books now as I used to, but back then I used to read a lot of books, and a lot of those books were technical books. So many years before, I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which is still, I think, an amazing book. And I was quite surprised, actually. Recently, I gave a talk somewhere to a group of technical people, and I asked if anyone had actually read the book, and nobody put up their hand, which is surprising given that I think it was the Royal Society recently did a big survey about the 50 most influential science books, and in the last 50 years, I think, and this book was number one. So if you haven't read it, it's still a great book to read. I guess you have to kind of get into the idea. It's certainly been challenged a lot, and it's a kind of nihilistic book, I guess, in a way too. But I think it's also often interpreted incorrectly, or a lot of the criticism about it is an incorrect reading of the central thesis of the book, which is really just a gene-centric view of evolution. And the other book that was really important to me was Daniel Dennett's book, which basically he read a lot of Richard Dawkins. Daniel Dennett's an American philosopher. He read a lot of Richard Dawkins, and he basically expanded on the idea of evolution and thought about the whole meaning of life based on the idea that we're all evolved from simpler organisms through this kind of, non-teleological process of chance and necessity. And at that time also, I was really lucky. I visited a friend, Gene Youngblood, who was, people might know, is a fantastic media theorist in the 1990s. And I was visiting with a couple of friends, some other people who I knew. And Gene was a very generous person. He invited us to his house for dinner in the desert of New Mexico in Santa Fe. And he said, "Do you want to meet this guy? I think you'd be really interested in him. His name's Chris Langton." And I said, "Yeah, sure. Sounds interesting." And it turned out Chris Langton was the guy who founded the whole field of artificial life. And so we went around to his house for a barbecue, and we drank and had fantastic discussions. And he was telling me about this idea about artificial life and how life could be manifest in other media apart from biological media. And that really set the course of my kind of research investigations for decades to come. So it's obviously having good opportunities is a great way of getting ideas. But of course, I had actually read some of he held a conference in the late 1980s at the Santa Fe Institute. And that was a really seminal conference. It brought together people from many different disciplines, including artists, scientists, biologists, philosophers. Really interesting time. And then there's also people like the crazy Rudy Rucker, who's a mathematician who was experimenting with things like cellular automata. Benoit Mandelbrot, I remember I was in Sydney and he came just after he'd written this, or no, it wasn't just after he'd written this book, quite a while after he'd written this book. And I think it was at the Opera House, and it was sold out with people in the aisles wanting to hear someone talk about fractals. I think if anyone tried to talk about fractals now, it'd be highly unlikely that they'd sell out the Opera House. Okay, so these are all quite technical and scientific books, but they're also more than that. I think many of the authors in them try and understand humanity's place in the world through scientific ideas. And I found these still really fascinating and certainly, something that I'm very much subscribed to. But at the same time, I was also looking at other interpretations. So how do people deal with the whole idea of things like selfish genes or the sort of philosophical implications of biological evolution? And for that, I turned to some really great authors, and I've just put a few of them here. I'll just talk really quickly about a couple of them. I don't know if many people are familiar with any of these books. It doesn't matter if you're not, you may not find them as interesting as I did, but Barry Lopez is a really interesting author. I guess he falls into this category of writers who just write about their life experiences, but from a perspective of awareness about the world and the natural environment. So his book is called About This Life. It's a really great book. It's just a collection of essays about their personal stories, about people that he's met, things that he's done. I mean, just to give you an example, there's a really interesting story where in the 1970s, he witnessed a plane crash, and the plane was full of cattle that were bound for Tokyo. It crashed in Anchorage in Alaska, I think. And the plane was bound for Tokyo, and it crashed just after takeoff. And he remembers taking a flight a couple of days later and flying over the crash site and seeing these carcasses of animals as he took off. And so he took it upon himself as an author and a researcher to actually spend some time traveling on cargo planes for a couple of years. So he spent a couple of years, I don't know how he did this, but he managed to get on a whole lot of cargo planes and fly around with them just to find out what the cargo was and why people were doing it, and the thoughts of the pilots who were taking all this stuff all over the world. And it's actually an incredibly fascinating story. It's an incredibly sad story too, about the way that humanity simply treats animals as cargo. And he talks about how people, they'd just be loaded into cages, and often the animals would be sedated. And there's a story once of a pilot who in a sort of mid-transatlantic flight went down to the cargo hold just to have a look around, and there was a tiger, a white tiger there that was bound for the Middle East, and the tiger hadn't been sedated properly, and it ran at him and hit itself on the cage and let out this roar that was so loud it was basically louder than the sound of the engines. And then he also talks about things like the smell on the plane of the animals sweating for 12 hours while they're being, shipped as cargo and things. So it's not all depressing reading either too, even though that story was pretty confronting. He also talks about groups of people who he knows. There's a group who he doesn't explain, he keeps the names and the location secret, but a group of people who are kind of both professional and amateur artists who gather around this ritual of a kiln, a sort of a super kiln where they bring pottery to be fired. And the story is not interesting because the pottery is interesting. It's not that. It's more that the people are interested in the ritual and process of being a human community in an environment. And a lot of these books, the other ones I've mentioned there, I won't go into details, but they think about the environment, or they talk about the environment in a way that scientific books don't, about the human connection to the environment, the importance of process in doing something, even if the process is not for making great art or exhibiting it, but getting a satisfaction from a process, a ritual, if you like, that involves other people as well. And so all of these ideas were kind of running around in my head, and I was thinking, this is really, really interesting. I mean, the other book I should really mention is the Ed Wilson book, Journey to the Ants. Even if you're not interested in ants, this is a fantastic book. It just shows how it's inspiring because of the way that people are able to look at things that often many people would just find trivial or annoying, and discover so much about the world through them. Anyway, I better move on. So all of these ideas are kind of floating around in my head, and I'm trying to think about, well, how do I turn them into something? And one of the books, actually, I'll just go back. One of the books I didn't mention was also James Hamilton Patterson, Seven Tenths. It's a really great book too. It's just a mediation on people and nature, with particular reference to the sea. So the sea has this sort of mythic character that is sort of prone to a lot of really great novels and things like that. But he sort of unpacks a lot of that. And, all of these books are in a way kind of lamenting the destruction that humans have wreaked upon nature over the years. And through this book by James Hamilton Patterson, I became really interested in this English poet. And I guess most of my references are kind of Anglophile references too. But it's Gerard Manley Hopkins. He wrote this poem in the late 19th century, and he was really upset by a housing estate that was being built in a row of poplar trees that he'd always loved as a kid. And one day a whole lot of people came with axes and cut them all down just to make way for this housing estate. And so he was deeply affected by this kind of betrayal of a natural environment purely for the sake of a housing development, something that we're still accustomed to today. And I think the poem is really prophetic. He says, I've highlighted it there. Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew, hack and rack the growing green. So this was a real shock to me, because I thought things like environmentalism and a sort of, lament for nature that had been destroyed was a more recent thing. But it turned out that for centuries, people had been thinking about this idea, and they'd been worrying about it, not just purely for the economic or other or aesthetic value, but for the kind of connection that people have with land and landscape. And that was a very strong connection that I felt growing up in Australia, being fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in the kind of national parks and native parts of Australia that are untouched by human development, or largely untouched by human development. And one of the last lines of the poem is that aftercomers cannot guess the beauty been, and that line has just always stuck with me. It's so powerful to think that once you destroy something, it's gone forever, and nobody will ever really know what that was like. So at the time I was thinking about these things and thinking, well, how does that, how can I express this kind of concern I have, and what does it hold for the future? And a lot of that is bound with experience. So I'm going to talk about some of the experiences now. And I love this. I mean, everyone has their favorite Rumi quote, right? But this one's great. New organs of perception come into being as a result of necessity. Therefore, increase your necessity so that you may increase your perception. So I was very conscious of this, and I did try and increase my perception. And I was very lucky that I got invited up with a couple of other people, I think Stellak and Josephine Stars, I think, in the early 2000s to Darwin to give a talk up there on media arts. And so we all gave our talks, and that was great, hung out for a while. And then I decided, because I'd never been up to the northern part of Australia before, to spend some time in a little place called Lynchfield National Park. I've kind of highlighted it here on the slide. It's a very beautiful national park. Most people went to Kakadu at the time, which is much bigger, but Lynchfield is incredibly beautiful. It has these amazing termite mounds, landscapes that span as far as you can see, with lots of gorges and mountains and little rivers that you can swim in if you're careful and don't get eaten by crocodiles. Anyway, so I spent a large amount of time by myself, just camped in the middle of nowhere and with very little human interaction. And that was actually a very kind of cathartic experience. At first it was really boring. So I'd sit around at my tent all day and go for walks and just start looking at things. And that's fine for the first day. But by the second day, you're kind of getting bored. But after about 4 or 5 days, I really found I lost all sense of time. And I just started spending hours watching ants moving across the landscape and the way that they did things. And again, it was this kind of experience, in connecting it with all the books that I'd been reading, was really, really powerful. And I started to think about a way in which, nature in the future might be, when there wasn't any nature left because we destroyed it all, and how could we still keep up this thing that, Edward Wilson called it biophilia, the innate love of nature. Manly Hopkins used the term inscape to represent it. And that's really where I came up with the vague concept for this work. I wanted to have something that reminded me of the ants, that worked at a different timescale, that had its own kind of ecosystemic relationship with its audience. And flying back on the plane over the landscape, it really made me think of a lot of Indigenous art, because often that kind of takes this completely different perspective. And think about how I could create a work that referenced this loss of nature, but was not just simply a lament for it, but offered some kind of possibility for the future, an electronic version of nature that might act as a kind of weak substitute for everything that we'd destroyed. So let's talk about experimentation. So I set to task to actually try and start making this work, and I really had no idea about the form it would take, but I did just think back to my time at Lynchfield and watching the ants. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to create this kind of tiny universe. It's going to be very, very simple. It's not going to be like real ants or anything like that, but it's just going to abstract all those ideas. And at the time, there was this concept of what's called the virtual laboratory. That was that you could code up a simulation of something and turn it into a model universe, and that would be a kind of petri dish. That's a very common word used recently for experimentation. So you could put your bugs in the petri dish and watch them grow and observe them, and you were kind of like the scientist with the microscope, only you were more the experimenter with the computer. So I built this sort of miniature universe, and it's very simple. It just has three kinds of things in it. Rocks, which are hard and opaque. If you bump into them, they'll hurt you. Something called biomass, which you could think of as like plants, that's soft and nutritious and that just grows according to the amount of sunlight that it receives. And these things that I just called animals or creatures, which were carnivorous, so they like to eat the biomass. They'll also eat each other if they have to. And that's it. And basically those three things form this world. I'll go into a little bit more detail as we progress, but I started off with a very simple algorithm, just a simple way that the animals could decide what they wanted to do. So if they smelt the food, they could move towards it and they could eat it. If they ran into another creature, they could choose to hit them, or they could choose to mate with them. If they chose to hit with them and they had more energy than the other creature, they could kill them and then eat them. If they chose to mate with them, they could have offspring, and the offspring would inherit the kind of genetic structure of the parents. And so it was like a little tiny model of biological evolution, or a kind of an ecosystem, a tiny little model ecosystem. And I became really fascinated by this. It's kind of impossible to describe, and it probably sounds super geeky because it is. But I spent hours and hours kind of playing with this ecosystem. I remember one night working really, really late, and I kept changing the algorithm and changing the parameters and watching the behavior of these creatures, like I'd been watching the ants in the national park. And one morning I came back and the whole screen had kind of exploded because one creature had become like this kind of it just got a lot of reward from mating, and the creatures had bred until the whole landscape was completely full of these creatures. There was no food left. And then, of course, I came in at exactly the right moment, because shortly after they all died off because there was no resources left. So I found this really, really fascinating, and I spent hours and hours kind of playing with it and watching it, much to the demise of other work, I guess. And then the opportunity came to exhibit it. So a curator contacted me and said, "I'm organising this show in Sydney at the Kazula Powerhouse. Do you want to exhibit some work?" I said, "Yeah, I've been working on this artificial life simulation. It's this kind of virtual ecosystem of these creatures that eat food and bump into rocks." And I don't think she was that impressed with the idea, but she said, "All right, okay." So it's not a very good photo, but this is the picture from the original exhibition. So this is the first exhibition of the work. So I kind of went in there thinking people are going to love this. They're going to get so much fun out of this because I've spent hundreds of hours working on it. It was a complete flop. So most people came and they kind of looked at it for a few minutes and then just walked off. And I was really disappointed. I thought, oh no, nothing's working. I'd had that previous exhibition where I'd spent, years working on something and it didn't really work out. And now I had this thing that I hadn't spent years on, but I thought was fantastic, but nobody else did. And so some of the criticisms were that, people didn't get it. They only wanted to spend a few minutes with it, whereas you really had to spend a long time. The complexity was too opaque for the casual visitor. So I hadn't really considered a lot of things, particularly the context of the gallery experience for this, and also that not everyone finds these kinds of geeky things as fascinating as perhaps I did. And part of the pleasure came from the creation rather than from just the observation. So anyway, I think one of the key things was that I could have just stopped there and said, oh, well, this is a bad idea, and that would have become a dead end, and I could have started something else. But I really started to think more deeply about, well, why is it that I'm so fascinated with this, whereas other people weren't? So I thought I really have to try and convey something about the fascination that I get in a way that's perhaps not necessarily more accessible, but it's more sort of visceral, is more phenomenological or experiential rather than kind of being cerebral. So you don't have to have read all the books that I've read or written the code to actually understand it. So while I was doing this, I set about really trying to improve the the overall quality of the work, the sophistication of the algorithms that were being used, the way that the work was presented, the experience for the viewer, and so on. So another opportunity arose shortly after. I was invited by the Melbourne Film Festival to exhibit the work. It's kind of strange that people were, even though I'm saying these works are flops, people were still saying, can you show some work? Which I'm really, really grateful for, that they had enough faith, even though I didn't think they were very good. So then the next, sorry, I'll just go back. One of the things that I did add was the ability for the individual creatures to make and listen to sound. And this is kind of key. So the first version, they did make sounds, but they were just like blips and blops. When they ate something, they blipped in happiness. And when they got killed, they went, and stuff like that. But I started to think about how sound could become much more part of the whole experience. And especially, we are talking early 2000s when computers weren't very fast. So I added the ability for the creatures to listen to sound and to actually make sounds, to synthesize sounds, and to recompose sounds from short fragments at a whole series of different frequency spectrums. The other big breakthrough was that I started using more advanced machine learning techniques too. So the creatures could actually learn things over a period of time. They could adapt and change to the way that they experience their environment, and they could think up new behaviors and things. So the behaviors that they actually come up with were really fascinating even to me. So they learnt to hibernate in the winter. They learnt to sing to warn of predators. So if a parent had some offspring and a predator was approaching, they would make a noise to let them know that. When one offspring of a creature found food, it would make a noise for the other to come and get it. So you're actually ending up with these fairly sophisticated behaviors that were similar to what you would observe in nature in a completely artificial electronic ecosystem. Also at this time, because I was an academic as well, I was writing papers about this. And that was a great experience. The first paper I published, ironically, I presented at September 10th, 2001, just the day before September 11. So I was with a couple of colleagues. We were in Prague in the Czech Republic. And of course, the next day, all those planes flew into the World Trade Center, and the conference actually didn't get cancelled. It got stopped. So we actually watched live as the second plane flew into the World Trade Center. So it kind of put a bit of a damper on the presentation and the research that followed that. But in the longer term, I actually found presenting this work at academic conferences, and particularly technical ones, was really encouraging. So maybe one of the differences between presenting work artistically and presenting it technically, at least in my experience, is that many people who are technical are much more open to the idea that you're doing something really unusual, and they tend to look more at the positive aspects of it, whereas perhaps in the arts, people are more critical about the conceptual and aesthetic ideas, which I think both are good. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I did really find it a great experience to be able to publish papers and talk about the technical aspects of it, because they are pretty geeky and techy, I guess, but also to be encouraged to look further at ideas. And so I got a lot of really great feedback, which I took on board from presenting. And I'll talk more about the papers towards the end of the talk. So the second exhibition was at Cherry Bar in Melbourne. So this was a different kind of context. It was to run for 48 hours continuously. So at various stages of the exhibition, it was open during the day, but also at night. And there was like a kind of DJ in there and stuff. But this was a really good testing ground for the next iteration of the work. And the big change that I made was thinking about the presentation, bringing the conflict between the virtual and the real, which is something that I've looked at a lot in all the work that I've done. But the original exhibition of just the computer screen, I just projected the computer screen in a room and thought that was enough. Whereas here I started to think more deeply about how this artificial world related to the physical world. And it does go back to those books that I was talking about before, about thinking about the relationship between people and place and nature. So the idea was extended to using these translucent screens and projecting several versions of the world on these screens. And they formed like an X shape from above. And because it was, kind of in a nightclub, I thought, what a great idea if we start filling the room with fog and make it kind of foggy. And this had the amazing effect of actually turning the 2D projection into this kind of amazing 3D space. So it sort of brought this virtual world into the real world in a way that just simply looking at a screen couldn't. And the other thing that was really interesting about this approach was that you could see other people through the screen. So you could be talking to someone or staring at them through the screen, and yet these creatures were kind of the interface between that conversation. And so it really helped to sort of merge this artificial world into the real world. So, I mean, this exhibition was a little bit more promising. So lots of people hung around, not for 48 hours continuously, but there was people who were there all night. I think certain substances might have helped them stay there for quite a while, but it was a pretty good success. But some of the feedback I got was, is this interactive? I don't really know how to interact with it. Other people said it reminded them of being in a forest, which was really great. Other people said, yeah, it looks really cool. It seems to be doing stuff, but I don't really understand what's going on. So again, I thought, okay, is this really working? What worked and what didn't work? So one of the things that was really important for me at the time was reconceptualizing the idea of how we interact with computers. So this is the only kind of HCI slide I'm going to show. So generally people had, up until this time, I mean, it's not completely, the thoughts were not completely this way, but a lot of people thought of computers as tools. So the computer, the user makes a gesture, has an intent, the computer analyzes that intent, interprets it, and then creates some output, and the person responds to that. So I was really interested at the time, and there are a few people around the world reconceptualizing the idea of computers in this way, and it actually goes back to this sort of the cybernetic revolution in the 1950s and the 1960s, but thinking of the computer as being part of a kind of ecosystem that includes the environment in which it operates and the way that it senses the world and its output influences the world. So my idea was really more along the bottom part of this diagram, thinking of the computer as a component in an ecosystem that includes human elements, natural elements, but also computational or cybernetic elements as well, and trying to combine those things in a way that reconceptualizes the computer as being something that's beyond a tool, something that forms part of a new kind of ecosystem, both metaphorically and in the case of this work, kind of literally as well. So I spent a lot of time kind of reconceptualizing how some sort of interaction might take place and how the creatures might have more of a relationship with people that wasn't one of interaction in that you do something and the creature responds, but more like the way that you would interact with a natural environment. So what I ended up doing was putting a camera in the environment and looking at the way that people moved in the environment and just simply using someone's presence as a method of generating food for the creatures in the environment. So the premise of this was that if you find this work interesting, you're more likely to stay and look at the work for longer. So therefore, if the virtual creatures in this artificial environment can keep you interested, then you're more likely to stay. So by connecting the food to the, by connecting a person's presence, which is a proxy for them being interested in the work, to the food production in the environment, I created this symbiotic link between the audience and this artificial ecosystem. So what actually happens is that over time, the creatures learn that by making interesting noises, they can keep people within the environment for a longer period of time and therefore increase their production of food. So even though they have no explicit knowledge about people in the environment, they simply learn through this machine learning evolutionary process that by making interesting sounds, their food production increases. So the creatures that survive are the ones that make interesting sounds. And for me, this was the real breakthrough moment of the work. It was just thinking about this idea of interaction, and I wouldn't have come up with it if I hadn't really thought deeply about the criticism that the earlier exhibitions of the work had received. So yeah, this was my real sort of eureka moment, thinking, yeah, this is finally I've worked out a way to interact with this, which is not sort of traditional computerist tool way. It's much more computerist as ecosystem way. So this is the final version that I ended up with. And this was not until 2004. So it did take three and a half years to go from the initial concept, which I whipped up, within a couple of weeks, to having this sort of mature version of the work. And along that pathway, there were lots of changes that were made, and I wasn't just working on this work alone. So the system has this camera that detects, as I said, the presence of people within a close proximity to the environment. There's multi-channel audio that sonifies the sound being made by the creatures in the environment. There's 2 projectors and 2 screens that are translucent, and a fog machine that kind of creates this sort of misty, forest-like environment through which you experience the intersection between the virtual and the real. So again, I was very fortunate. By 2004, I'd been asked by the Australian Centre for the Moving Image I had a solo show there, and it also included a retrospective of all the work that I'd done. And I was very lucky that ACME also funded a monograph on my work. So there was a fair bit of pressure to get this work into shape, I guess. And I had actually shown it at a couple of other places overseas since then. But this was the first sort of major exhibition of the work in a form that I felt I was really satisfied with. And as I said, it corresponded with exhibition of several other works that I'd done over the last few years and a monograph. So that was fantastic. The response was really interesting. There was one person who I got to know. So the exhibition ran, I think, for 4 weeks. There was one person I got to know who came in. He worked in an office building just over the road from ACME. And I think he came in on about the 2nd or 3rd day. And he really liked it. And he came in every day for the entire exhibition. And he would come in at lunchtime and bring his lunch and eat his lunch. And after a week of seeing this guy there all the time, I kind of started talking to him. And I said, why are you coming in here? And he said, for me, this is my escape. I work in this office and, it's kind of boring. And when I come in here, it's like being in a forest, and every day it's different, and I never get sick of being in here. And, my eyes kind of welled up, and I felt very humbled that I'd been able to create something that I'd set out to do, which was to create an experience of an electronic nature that people actually, got a sense of satisfaction from. And, over the weeks, there were lots of really interesting, apart from all the normal school groups that come in there and millions of kids that run around, there was, I remember a couple, an elderly couple, and it was really interesting seeing the sort of gender difference in the way that people responded to the work. So this elderly man and his wife came in, and he obviously read the catalogue and read the monograph, which went into a lot of detail about the work, and said, he was trying to explain it to his wife, and he's saying, this uses a technique that's based on evolution, and there are these artificial creatures that are consuming food based on our presence in the environment. And at one point, she just told him to shut up and said, I just want to experience it. So to me, I thought that was another really poignant moment, because people just liked the visceral experience of it, which is something that the earlier versions of the work hadn't been able to achieve. It ran for 4 weeks. I think it worked really successfully. It didn't break down. It ran actually continuously for 4 weeks. One of the things we did have to do, though, was, as I mentioned, the production of food came from the presence of people. So, of course, when the gallery closed at 5 or 6 o'clock at night, the entire population of creatures died out and had to be replenished the next day. So I had to build something in after the first couple of days. I realized this and built something in that basically stopped that from happening. I noticed Alan on Twitter commented on this image. That's Alan, her colleague who worked with. It's kind of become iconic. I've actually seen it appear. The ABC, I think, has it on file. I keep emailing them saying they shouldn't use it, but every time there's a story about AI, they use this image. And since that time, I guess the work has been successful. Following that exhibition, it's been exhibited, I think, over 25 times all around the world. I actually had to get other people to help me exhibit it because I couldn't be in so many places at once, or I didn't really want to travel that much. And the great thing I think about exhibiting it over a large number of places is seeing culturally how people respond to it in different ways. But always, I think people understand the idea that this is a kind of electronic, natural ecosystem that isn't interactive in the way that you think of interactives being traditionally interactive, but it still does interact with you. It has a symbiotic relationship with you. It's always great showing it in Brazil because everyone loves to dance in there, which I think is quite amazing. I've come in a few times at exhibitions in Brazil in particular where people are dancing in there, which I always think is quite funny. Yeah, and just to kind of talk a little bit about the outcomes and reflect on those a little bit. 25 exhibitions over the last 18 or 19 years. I ended up doing 6 publications from this work alone, one of which won a Best Paper Award, so that's really good to tick those academic boxes. It won some awards, some media art awards internationally. There's been lots of media articles written about it. I just put in one in here from an exhibition in the early mid-2000s, I think. And very humbling too was that the work was acquired by Itaú Cultural in Brazil in 2019. So, I mean, it's great that if you're Brazilian, you can go and see the work whenever you want. But if you're in Australia, unfortunately, you can't. So I think, it ended up being reasonably successful, and I'm not really here to talk about that. I think more what I wanted to talk about was this whole idea of why personally I think the work is great. And I think the work is great for me, not because it was successful. I mean, that's always great, but personally, I find it very satisfying because at first it didn't work. And I think what I learned from the whole experience was that you have to be able to listen to criticism and try and respond to it, but you also have to know when some criticism isn't really going to help you. So that only comes through, a kind of maturity about thinking very deeply about what you understand as what the work is trying to achieve. I think having really strong ideas, and my ideas aren't that strong, but I think the authors, some of the authors that I mentioned, are very inspirational, and getting those ideas from those people really help. And you do have to understand them. You have to understand them deeply, and I feel like I do. And you make them your own through your experiences. And so, as I mentioned, if I hadn't spent that time, taking advantage of the opportunity of being in a national park for so long, if I'd just given up after a certain period of time because the reception to the work was poor, I never would have achieved what I ended up achieving. And also, I kind of just wanted to say that, a lot of it was a huge amount of work. It wasn't easy to do this. Often, I'd be working back really late and spending a lot of time and perhaps neglecting other things that I should have been doing. But, I don't think there was ever a time where I didn't enjoy doing what I was doing. I found a huge amount of satisfaction in the results that were done, partially because just working in this area it surprises you, it delights you, it makes you, it gives you a sense of satisfaction that I think, you can only get from doing stuff, painting, writing, building, whatever. For me, at least, that was really, really important. So, I mean, just to kind of finish off, because I know everyone's anxious to get to the chic drinks. What does greatness mean? Well, I think one of the lessons I learned from this is that to do a great work, it doesn't need to be, it's rarely that you plan, that you set out to change the world. You often hear this kind of idea, let's change the world, let's do something great. But it's rare that you actually set out with a fully understood plan. And always the best work I've done has never been stuff that I've done where I've written a grant application and done exactly what I said I'd do in the grant, and everything was understood from the beginning. So, I think it's great to, it's great to think that you don't have to have a fully formed idea, but you have to be willing to engage with it and pursue it and refine it. You also need an audience. Without an audience, the work remains unfinished. That was another great thing I got from the from the book About This Life, that an audience for your work is really important. You have to seek out the knowledge and understanding for what you're doing, and you have to become critical about what you accept and what you reject. And that just comes through experience. There's this 10,000 hour rule that it takes you 10,000 hours to become an expert at something, whether it's playing the violin, learning to code, learning to paint or draw. Any of those things take 10,000 hours. That's a lot of time and it's a lot of effort. So you don't want to waste that time and effort. And thinking carefully and deeply about what you want to spend your 10,000 hours on, I think is really, really critical, because it's not something that's encouraged in education. You kind of just thrown from high school to university to wherever you end up without really having a sense of, well, I'm going to be investing a large portion of my life in this. So, how do I go about choosing what's right for me? The other thing is, I think it's really good to listen to criticism. Often it hurts and it's bad. If you spend a huge amount of effort doing something and it falls flat, that really deflates you. I cried on the way home on driving back from Bendigo, thinking, why am I doing this to myself? But they're cathartic experiences, and the ability to listen to criticism and really think about whether it's valid and not take it personally is a sign of maturity, I think. Also, nothing's easy. Doing great work usually means doing hard work, but I've met a lot of people who work very hard, who I don't think feel the same sense of satisfaction as I do. So, working hard is necessary, but maybe not the only thing you need to think about. The other thing is obvious that most people say, don't give up if it's not right. So, as I mentioned, I believed in the idea enough because I felt a personal sense that this was worth pursuing, and that's what drove me to keep going. And eventually it ended up in a good place. The other thing that was really helpful was documentation, describing and explaining. So writing those technical papers was not a chore or something that I just did because I was in academia. It was actually really helpful for me to think and get clarity around the process. So it turned experimentation into something more. Just if experimentation becomes tinkering or play, then I don't think it really develops into everything that it can. So having a way to articulate that experimentation in a more formal sense is really helpful. And it helps clarify ideas, knowledge, and so on. And so I used the kind of those trifactors of having strong ideas, having good ideas, choosing how you experience the world is really important, and not being afraid to experiment was the way that I ended up with something that gave me a lot of personal satisfaction. So that's the end of the talk. I thought I'd end with a sunset and say that the story did have a happy ending, but it took 20 years almost for it to really end up being, I really feel like it's kind of concluded now. So you really have to be thinking in the long term. So if you're worried about being stuck at home for the next 3 months or 6 months, it's a good time to put that time to use and think about where you want to be in 10 or 20 years' time. So thanks for everyone who's still here and still listening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. That's all from me. And if anyone has any questions, you can type them in, or I don't know if we're going to try and go live. And thanks everyone for the comments. But if anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer it. Or Katie's saying we can go live with mics if people want to ask their question rather than typing it in, because that is a bit tedious.
Hi, John. I've got my mic on. I've enabled everyone's mic, so you should be able to, I think, turn your mic on yourself.
So I can see a question from Simon already. So Simon says, do you think that audiences are more tech savvy now and might appreciate better the original artwork? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, certainly people are more familiar with technology and perhaps less fascinated by it as well. So, I mean, I've shown the work relatively recently. I think last year was the last time it got shown. The response is usually fairly similar. I think I mean, the work is not, I don't look at it as a technological work in the sense of it being about the technology. I mean, maybe that sounds strange to say for someone who works so, kind of intimately with the technology, but what I think people get out of it is a sense of the experience, that it's the strangeness of being in a space that feels like it's natural, that has its own kind of logic and time and place, and yet it's kind of, it's sort of exciting in a way because there's fog and there's lights and there's sound and things. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that really answers the question. I don't think so. I don't think the concepts that are being expressed in there are more well known now than perhaps they were 10 or even 20 years ago. I mean, all those books that I was talking about, all of those theories have been around for decades. So it's not like scientifically they're anything very new. I mean, they've certainly had more, there's been more investigation into them, and there's been sort of, counter arguments put to some of the things, like selfish gene theory has a lot of proponents who now consider a more nuanced view regarding things like group selection. And, there's the whole thing about junk DNA that was discovered following in the last decade or so. But, more for me, it's kind of about the visceral experience. Question from Tom. What's your concept of Eden at all influenced by conversation with Jane Prophet? Good question, Tom. So certainly, yeah, I know Jane very well. And in the 90s, we were in a lot of shows together, and she made a work called Technosphere, which was kind of a 3D virtual world. And, Jane's still a friend now. Yeah, so certainly I was familiar with that work. And there were several people at the time who were making these kind of model universes. I guess her work was a little bit different, as I recall. I think you interacted with it on the earlier version. You interacted with via email. I mean, it had virtual creatures in it that evolved. I mean, there were all sorts of people working in this area from the 90s. So people like William Latham, Carl Sims, lots of other people. So yeah, maybe implicitly the concept was certainly influenced by that work. I think aesthetically it's very different. Conceptually too, I think it's quite different, but perhaps in the whole idea of having this kind of virtual world that people interact with, then yeah, it certainly was similar to that. Any other questions, or everyone's anxious to? Oh, from Oscar. Please, a quick thought on Borges. Why was he there? Oh, yeah, good question. I didn't really talk about him. I mean, he's my favorite poet, I think. When I was a teenager, I remember going into a bookstore and seeing one of his books, a book of his poetry on the bookshelf. And I only bought it because I liked the cover. I'd never heard of him, but I just picked it up and started reading it. And I think, after an hour, they were telling me, are you going to buy this book or are you going to move on? And so I bought the book and I never looked back. I think he's, for someone who works in technology and computing and logic and things, he's a fantastic author. He was very influential in the earlier work that I did. I was really honored that I actually went to Argentina 4 or 5 years ago, I think, and exhibited some work in the Borges Center in Argentina, which was fantastic. And I got to actually see a lot of his original handwritten poems. They have some there, which was, a very kind of spiritual experience. Yeah, I like his kind of the whole poetics about logic that are sort of surreal but human at the same time. I think that's why he really resonates with me. And I actually remember meeting, not for this exhibition, but an earlier exhibition, I met a woman who was, I think, his secretary. And maybe we're recording this, so maybe I don't want to say this in a recording, but she told me some very weird stories about him. Maybe I can tell you offline about it. But yeah, I think as a poet, he was really incredible. No other questions? Doesn't look like there are. So just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for staying to the end. I hope everyone has a fantastic Easter and turns off their screens and tries to get out in the world and enjoys the time to think and reflect about how you can achieve your own personal greatness. Thanks for coming along.